In 15 or 20 years' time, the black man will have the whip hand over the white man.
In 1865, when the enslavement of African Americans came to an end, many believed that a new era of liberty and justice was dawning. Yet by the start of the 20th century, these hopes looked forlorn. Black people were denied the vote and remained impoverished. Black people were victims of violence and murder. Across America, resistance to racism was met with deadly force. At the same time, as Europe's nations built empires across the globe, Africans and Asians were being stripped of their land and brutalized. In the West, popular culture reinforced the idea of a racial hierarchy and white supremacy by ridiculing black people. Throughout the 20th century, from the Mississippi cotton fields and South African diamond mines, a tale of exploitation and racial violence unfolds. Many people would lose their lives resisting, fighting battles that continue in many countries today. The campaign to abolish slavery in the United States had drawn support from all over the world. Abolition was acclaimed as a triumph for all humanity. But soon black Americans would realize that racism had outlived slavery. Near the end of the Civil War, the Northern Union Army had promised 40 acres to each freed slave who would fight the Southern Confederate Army. But the following year, the order was rescinded, and the lands were returned to the white plantation owners of the South, leaving many with no choice but to work for their former masters. They became farm laborers as part of a system known as sharecropping.
The way it worked is that a black family would work for a white landlord for a period of a year. And during that time, the family would receive canned goods, food, a plow, mules, animals, seeds, other implements that were necessary to produce a cash crop, let's say cotton. And the split was half, 50-50, minus the costs that had been incurred during the previous growing season by the black family. And what usually occurred, since the black household did not keep the books, blacks owed more money at the end of the year to white families, and so the debt was rolled over. Blacks essentially never got out of debt.
After the Civil War, the 13th and 14th Amendments to the Constitution outlawed slavery and extended the vote to adult black men. But in the South, these hard-won rights were thwarted.
What they did was to find ways to stop black people from voting. They created literacy tests, basically. They said, or other exams that you had to pass in order to be allowed to vote. And a white person would show up and they would be asked, you know, what country is this? And they would say, United States, go ahead, vote. And then a black person would show up and they'd first of all see if they could read. And if they could read, they would then ask them a question like, what is the third phrase in the First Amendment governing religion? Which, of course, most white people couldn't have answered either.
By the end of the 19th century, the southern states made it legal to offer so-called separate but equal services to their black citizens. These laws denied black Americans equal access to public amenities, such as education and transport, turning the United States into a racially segregated nation. Soon, millions living in the land of the free found themselves trapped by the Jim Crow system, named after a vaudeville act that ridiculed black people.
The key thing to grasp about the so-called Jim Crow laws is that they were really about enforcing the idea of racial inequality in everyday life. And so there were laws that explicitly governed things like where black people could sit in buses, whether they could stay in hotels, which hotels they could stay in, whether they could eat in the same places, and so on. But also around them was a set of practices of everyday life which were not legally enforceable, but which reflected the very same ideas. So, for example, black people weren't supposed to look white people in the face in the street. I mean, if there was not enough space on the pavement, the black person was supposed to get off. Or in the end, if you looked in the wrong place, if you did what was once called reckless eyeballing, if a black man looked at a white woman in the wrong way, he could end up being lynched.
Jim Crow, legal racial segregation, was a regime of white over black, and that the heart of Jim Crow was violence. And violence took several different forms, but the chief form it took was lynching. Between 1882 to about 1927, 3,500 African Americans were lynched in the United States. Jim Crow was a system of political and economic terror. Slavery was always a kind of perverse blessing for blacks in the sense that they were defined as property. In the early 1850s, a 21-year-old black man, a field hand, was worth $1,000. And so whites had a vested interest, perhaps to beat their slaves, but not to kill them.
The fear that white people had of black people was so deeply internalized and reinforced by church and government and business that black town halls were burned, black churches were burned. And if a black man defended himself against the aggressor, against a white man, not only could he be killed, but his family could be killed. He might be subjected to hours of torture. In some cases, more than one, a black man was tied on a log and burned from his feet up so that an extensive crowd of people could take pleasure out of the screams and the horror.
At his home near Savannah, Georgia, James Allen has collected a photographic record of racial violence in the South. For the past 20 years, he's found horrifying pictures in the family albums of ordinary Southern homes. Many are postcards that were mass-produced as souvenirs.
Some of these images were printed in the tens of thousands and sold for a dime or $1 a piece. Some of the postcards tell you where to write and the discounts you'll get if you buy 1, 10, or 100. They were sold in drugstores and pharmacies. They were sold on the street. I purchased a photograph from a woman. The photographer sold them door to door. Her mother bought the image for $2. A murder that is of particular interest to me was of a 17-year-old boy by the name of Jess Washington in Waco, Texas, in 1916. He was seriously mentally challenged. The wife of the farmer that he worked for was found dead. He was arrested. He was brought to trial. The trial took from 10 until 12. And when the jury came back at noon and found him guilty, someone in the courtroom, and it would have been anyone in the courtroom, screamed out, "Get that nigger." Then one of the worst and cruelest treatments of a human being began. Jess was kicked down out of the courthouse, down the back steps where a crowd of several hundred was waiting for him. They put a chain on his neck. There were 16,000 people crowding the street to watch this boy be tortured. Jess was tied to the chain over a branch of a tree. The fire was started. They raised Jess from the fire up into the air so that the crowd could see him. There were cheers, like at a football game, cheering the torturers on. When Jess tried to climb up the chains, hand by hand, they cut his fingers off one by one so that all he could do was slap at the chain. They lowered him back down in the fire. A man came up and castrated him. Another man kept a pole so that he couldn't crawl out of the fire. And time and again, they pulled him up to keep him from dying so that the crowd could be satisfied, until he finally died.
Many of these murders were instigated by America's most powerful agent of racial terror. At its peak, the Ku Klux Klan had up to 5 million members. An average of 2 lynchings every week resulted. The Klan was just one source of racial violence. Scores of Black Americans were killed during the Red Summer riots of 1919. More bloodshed followed 2 years later in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Over 300 people were killed and thousands were left homeless after envious white people attacked the city's most prosperous Black community. Much of this history of racial violence has been erased from public memory. Several state archives have cut out photographs and newspaper reports of lynchings. And James Allen's attempts to show his collection in Atlanta's leading academic institutions have been repeatedly blocked.
White America has maintained to this day control of the history of racial violence as victors. It's as if we live in an occupied country intellectually. And as long as white America maintains the power and maintains the myth of moral superiority, the history will never become public, fully public, and be written into our national conscience.
Violence was just one way of maintaining the racial hierarchy. Newspapers, film, and theatre stereotyped Black people as simple-minded figures of fun. Some Black performers applied minstrel makeup to caricature themselves as shuffling Negroes, reinforcing the sense of superiority amongst white audiences.
What it really essentially said about Black people is that we were outside of the pale of civilization. So to pillory and to make Blacks buffoons is to deny them human capacity. And for whites, it was a grand old time. And for the first half of the 20th century, minstrelsy and blackface was not just reputable, but it was a central feature of entertainment in America.
Everywhere you looked, Black people were being portrayed as dense, incompetent, irrational savages. In vaudeville and on stage, African-American people were reduced to silly, childlike characters who needed to be trained like a monkey. Thank God those savages were saved from their natural habitat.
In 1946, African-American soldiers returning from the war were being lynched at a rate of 1 a week.
There are cases when black soldiers waiting at the train station, waiting their ride, were lynched because how dare they wear that uniform? They had died for the lyncher and his right to murder them. This was the paradox and indeed the vicious irony of the black participation in the Second World War and the fight for democracy on foreign shores, which drove them to fight even more vigorously back here at home.
Protests from prominent anti-racists, including Paul Robeson and Albert Einstein, prompted President Truman, himself a former member of the Ku Klux Klan, to appoint a committee that campaigned to end lynching. At last, government initiatives to counter racism began to trickle through. In 1955, the ruling in the Brown versus the Board of Education case found that the provision of separate but equal schools was unconstitutional, bringing segregation in the education system to an end. White supremacists mounted resistance to the move. At Little Rock, Arkansas, National Guardsmen protected black pupils who had to run a gauntlet of racist violence in order to attend school. By the mid-1950s, those who resisted racism were liable to suffer severe reprisals, as was shown by the experience of a 14-year-old from Mississippi, Emmett Till.
I'm Simeon Wright, the son of Mose Wright. I lived in Mississippi in 1955. Emmett Till and my cousin Wheeler came to visit us Wednesday. This is the fateful night that we went into Money, Mississippi. Went to this little town, little store, Bryant's Grocery. After we got outside, Mrs. Bryant came out behind us, and she was walking towards her car, and that's when Emmett whistled at her. And when he whistled, man, it scared us out of our wits because we knew that was a taboo, and we couldn't get to the car fast enough to get out of there. Then we got in the car, we came home. Emmett and I, we went to bed, and about, I would say 2 a.m. in the morning, I heard this noise in the house, and I woke up. I saw two white men standing at the foot of the bed, and they marched Emmett out to the truck. So they took Emmett, and 3 days later, we found out that they had killed him. He was thrown in the Tallahatchie River. My dad said it looked like they had hit him in the head with a hammer. He was shot behind the ear. It was just a horrible scene.
I believe that the whole United States is mourning with me. And if the death of my son can mean something to the other unfortunate people all over the world, then for him to have died a hero would mean more to me than for him just to have died.
Emmett's mother, she decided that she wanted the world to see what those men had done to her son. So they had a cassette, the top was glass, and you could see the body. You could see his mutilated body during the funeral procession. And the whole world were able to see what the Jim Crow laws and the people of Mississippi, the white people of Mississippi, were doing to blacks.
I never will forget it. I was 5 years old when I saw that picture. I was just stunned by the ferocity of hate that had produced the violence on this young man's body. And for Negro Americans, it strengthened our resolve that Jim Crow had to go.
Emmett Till's death was a catalyst. Less than 4 months after the murder, on December the 5th, 1951, Rosa Parks was arrested when she refused to give up her seat on a bus to a white passenger in Montgomery, Alabama. When Martin Luther King called for the Montgomery bus boycott, 99% of the black population took part, action which led to a Supreme Court ruling in 1956, which desegregated the buses. The civil rights movement was born. Civil rights protests met with violence, as happened when black people tried to eat at segregated lunch counters. Throughout the 1960s, protesters were wounded, imprisoned, and killed. The movement's most articulate spokesmen were eventually silenced. Dr. King and Malcolm X were to be murdered.
With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day.
Freedom comes to us either by ballots or by bullets. That's the only way freedom is gotten.
Although the Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and 1968 prohibited discrimination, the majority of black people continue to live in substandard housing, go to poor schools, and experience a lifetime of poverty.
Well, you know, Martin Luther King Jr. saw the failure. He said it himself. He said, look, the first part of the movement, relatively speaking, was a piece of cake. Because it was easy for America. Civil rights bill, doesn't cost much. Give people the right to vote, doesn't cost much. But now what we're doing, the second part of the movement, the part about economic equality and social injustice, well, that's going to cost something. It's not about just letting us have access to the lunch counter. Martin Luther King Jr. said, what good is it to be able to go to a lunch counter but can't afford to buy a hamburger?
From 1964 to 67, there was fierce rioting in cities across the US, as African Americans found that the civil rights movement left them as poor as ever. In the United States, the overt structures of racism have been dismantled without many black Americans escaping poverty. A recent study found that in 1968, a typical black family had around 60% of the income of an average white family. Today, it has only 58%. Black unemployment is more than twice that of whites, a gap wider than in 1972. Black infants are almost 2.5 times more likely to die in their first year of life, worse than in 1970. The belief that we live in a post-racist society has blinded us to the impact that skin color plays in determining our destinies.
Identically qualified black and white resumes, where the black ones are identified by the fact that the candidate has a name that is recognizably associated with African-American identity, get different treatment when they arrive on the desks of employers. And this is not a hypothesis, this is an experiment that has been done in some cases with large amounts of data. And that's just still true. It's still true that being black disadvantages you in the employment market, just as, by the way, being a woman does, doing the same experiments. And that's despite the fact, probably, that the officials who manage this system don't think of themselves as racist and don't recognize what they're doing as practicing some kind of racial discrimination.
What drives the colorblind racism of the 21st century are three central institutional processes: mass unemployment, mass incarceration, and mass disenfranchisement. Mass unemployment, that is, for young black and Hispanic males between the ages of about 18 years to 35 years. In 1980, there were about 500,000 prisoners in the United States. Today, there are 2.3 million. About half of them are black in the United States. And so this process of mass incarceration in many states leads to the third pillar of colorblind racism, which is mass disenfranchisement. So in the state of Florida, in the year 2000, where George Bush wins the presidency by fewer than 600 votes, in that state, 818,000 Florida citizens who live in that state, they pay taxes to the United States, could not vote for the rest of their lives.
Disenfranchisement is not the only feature of Jim Crow to have resurfaced. In the mid-1990s, The Bell Curve became a bestseller by claiming that black people's poor performance in IQ tests proved their innate intellectual inferiority to white people. This was used to justify cutting back black people's benefits. But later criticisms were given little media attention. Its research relied on funding from the Pioneer Fund, a trust endowed by a Nazi sympathizer. Its authors acknowledged help from a professor who writes, "What is called for here is not genocide of incompetent cultures, but the phasing out of such peoples."
It was suggesting you can throw all the money you want, and you can try to give them all the education you want, it will be a waste. A pig is a pig is a pig is a pig, and you can't put a pig in a chicken coop, because pigs are pigs, and chickens are chickens, and eagles are eagles. And so what it was trying to suggest is that all the social programming and social engineering that you're putting forth to help black people is all for naught, because they're inherently inferior.
Today, science is eroding the biological basis for the idea of race. The Human Genome Project has found that the average genetic difference between one African and another is the same or greater than that between a black person and a white person. The only genes that distinguish races are those determining skin color, and yet for many people, those genes, just 5 out of around 25,000, continue to shape destinies and determine fates.
The mythology of race exists for no other reason than to justify the attempt of one group to dominate another. And the useful fiction of race continues to allow people to conspire against the best in our human communities. So you can say to a guy, for instance, who's trying to hail a cab in New York City, "Excuse me, cab, I know you think I'm a black man and that race exists. I'm a fiction. I'm a figment of your imagination. I'm a social construct. There's no biological base or empirical verification for my melanin differential. I'm simply another human being possessing a different magnitude of melanin. I still ain't picking you up because you're trying to go to Harlem, brother. That's race."
Despite the long struggle against racism, it continues to pollute our mental environment. Its enduring potency ensures that people are denied opportunities, justice, and human rights. Key institutions stay racially monolithic, and racial privilege endures. For 5 centuries, racism has legitimized assassination, massacres, and genocides. The doctrine of white supremacy has demonized, brutalized, and dehumanized the non-white peoples of the earth. Racism has been the global driving force behind the dispossession of continents, the destruction of civilizations, and the extermination of entire peoples. The legacy of enslavement and empire has created deadly divides between the West and the rest. In scientific terms, racial differences have no material significance. Yet racism continues to shape the destinies of individuals and nations all over our world.